Great. So yeah, thanks, Nigel, and nice to be back at the Bangor group to give a talk to you tonight. And part of an excellent program by the looks of it for the rest of the season as well. So yeah, back in January, I was fortunate enough to go down to South Africa, fairly last minute trip as it turned out, and to get on a cruise ship, my first experience on the cruise ship, alongside 1,900 odd other birders. Yeah, and I'll go on to talk about the experience of that and all the birds we saw there. So my talk tonight is in two halves, really. First half about the voyage down to Marion Island and the adjacent Prince Edward Island that makes up this little cluster of subantarctic islands. And then moving on to talk about KwaZulu-Natal, a coastal province which has a huge range of habitats in a fairly small area and includes some of South Africa's most interesting and hard to see endemics. So, yeah, let's get on to the first part. So, we got on an MSC cruise ship, and this is a partnership that's been formed by BirdLife South Africa with MSC, and they call them the flocks. And the one we went on was the fourth iteration of it. They've been the first couple, they just went out to sea and back, and very popular with the South African birders to sort of see some of the pelagic birds that you can't see from land. But the third one, they went down to Marion Island for the first time, a week-long trip, taking several days to get there and several days to get back. So, where is Marion Island? The red blob on the map there indicates Marion Island. So, it's sort of heading southeast from the coast of South Africa. As Nigel mentioned, about 1,000 miles from the mainland and almost halfway down to Antarctica itself. So, very popular with seabirds because it's one of a fairly small number of islands that give the suitable conditions for seabirds to nest and the good feeding opportunities and endless ocean in the Southern Ocean there. Lots of wind. This island lies in the roaring 40s, so it's windy almost every day of the year. And the map on the right shows Prince Edward Island adjacent, which is smaller, but it's technically more sort of ecologically resilient. It's not been hit with the same problems that Marion Island has, and is a more pristine set of species and numbers, actually. So I'll go on to talk about a couple of the problems Marion Island's facing, and one of the reasons we did this trip was to raise money for the conservation there. Yeah, so moving on. What is special about the Prince Edward Islands? Well, collectively, they're home to up to 8 million seabirds of many species. So, four species of penguin, I think five species of albatross, and many petrels, shearwaters, skuas, terns, all sorts. We weren't allowed to get that near to the islands for biosecurity reasons. So they imposed, the South African government imposed a 12 nautical mile radius within which we couldn't approach. Not too much of a problem because there's so many birds, we saw plenty from the boat itself. This is one of the key species found on Marion Island, the snowy albatross, what was part of the wandering albatross group of species. It's now been split, so the birds here are known as snowy albatross, and about 40% of the world's population breeds on Marion Island, so it's an incredibly important place for this species. It's got a phenomenal wingspan, up to 3.7 meters wingspan, and takes many years to reach maturity and breeds at very slow rates. So they're vulnerable to pressures from bycatch in the longline fishery, and a lot of these problems have been somewhat resolved, which has slowed down the decline. So yeah, I mentioned one of the previous flocks. We were booked to go on the 2022 one, but this was around the time when we were still coming out of COVID, and all of a sudden, very close to the trip, South Africa went back on the red list, and we couldn't get out there. So we cancelled our tickets, unfortunately, and didn't make it on that one. Thankfully, when I heard that BirdLife South Africa were going to run another one, we jumped on the opportunity and got tickets for that. It was fairly last minute actually, but that's because another idea of ours fell through. So we're like, okay, we're going to do this, and we booked the cruise and booked a short tour on the mainland afterwards as well. So getting into Durban, this is the coastline of Durban with the massive stadium, the Moses Mabhidi Stadium. That dominates the skyline, but yeah, it was a useful base just before the cruise. Really, we happened to stay in that hotel right next to the stadium, so that was a nice start. Before we got on the boat, we had a few hours, so popped to the Botanic Gardens in Durban. I always find Botanic Gardens great places to start a birding trip because they have a good cross section of the common birds. Pardon me. And due to being fairly urban and receiving lots of visitors, those birds tend to show quite well. So one of the first birds we saw was the bronze manakin, a rather finch-like bird, pretty small, and also the southern red bishop. And this was a fantastically coloured bird of the marshes present in the Botanic Gardens. Also in the marshes and actually breeding here were African spoonbill, pretty distinctive with that red flesh around the face and red legs. And a good one to get us going on the raptor front, the palm nut vulture. Whilst this is widespread throughout Africa, it's quite rare in this part of Africa. So yeah, the KwaZulu coastline's a bit of a stronghold for the species. And one I wasn't sure we were going to see at all was the black goshawk. Fantastic bird of prey. Just and that contrast in the wings, and yeah, so it was nice to get the trip off to a flying start with some of these birds. So this is us in front of the MSC Musica, the ship that we were going down to the Marion Islands on. This is only part of the ship. I couldn't fit it all in the photo. Well, Sophie couldn't, should I say? And yeah, huge ship. I think it can take a lot more people than were actually on board, but that meant we had plenty of space and didn't actually ever feel like we were too crammed in. So here was the route. This was taken from someone who was on the boat and ran a GPS. So it's the actual route we took, fairly straight all the way down and back. But we had time whilst down there to complete a full navigation of the islands. And before leaving harbour, we took opportunity to take advantage of the facilities on board, which was the only time we actually managed to, because from the moment we left port, that was it. We were into full-on birding mode along with everyone else on board. So quite often the pool and the crazy golf actually lied quite empty, as no one was particularly interested. And we had a nice room on board the ship with a balcony there. We took time to spend on the balcony looking at the seabirds, but quite often the best place to be was on the main decks where there were lots of pairs of eyes, lots of guides, volunteer guides who'd come on, all with past experience of being on pelagics off the South African coastline and had a lot of experience to share. So the first day at sea, we were still in fairly warm waters off the coast, and this was a particularly interesting time for the South African birders on board, and they made up most of the contingent as they could get birds on their South African list, which they wouldn't necessarily normally see. Largely, people were still in shorts and t-shirts, but as we ventured southwards, more and more layers went on. One of the first birds was the great-winged petrel. These became fairly numerous, but that was, I mean, the first of many new seabirds for me, having not been to the Southern Ocean before. And we got our first albatross of the trip with Indian yellow-nosed. This one cruised past the ship, showing nicely. Has a little smudge on the face, but there's a few features which separate this from the tricky Atlantic yellow-nosed albatross. But given where we were, no Atlantic yellow-nosed albatross were seen on this trip. And one that birders in the UK might be somewhat familiar with, the Cory's shearwater. It was nice to see these at the sort of opposite end of the world, doing part of their migratory routes that covers most of the Atlantic Ocean. And yeah, nice and distinctive with that yellow beak. And it didn't take long till we got a soft plumage petrel. The first one I was super excited about, and then they ended up becoming one of the most numerous birds of the trip. So whilst this is on the UK list, very few people have seen it. So it was nice to catch up, showing that complete neck collar, which distinguishes it from a few of the other Pterodroma petrels. And I think it was our second day in the trip when we got our first snowy albatross. This is a fairly young bird with a lot of black in the wing. As they age, they get progressively paler feathering, and they'll lose that black tail band on the tail as well. So yeah, second full day. A lot more coats on people by this point, a lot of hats and gloves. It was starting to get chilly. And as it got chilly, we were all getting more and more excited for what would turn up next. So yeah, there was these open decks with lots of people on, but actually it was quite easy to find space to view. It wasn't too jam-packed or anything, and you get clusters of people around some of the guides who were very useful for picking up and identifying some of the trickier species out there. And we started seeing more great-winged petrels, flocks and rafts sat on the sea whilst the weather was calm. But as it started getting windier and choppier, we were seeing a lot more birds in flight. And a very similar species, the white-chinned petrel, which showed well. This has the distinctive white chin, although not all of them show that, and then actually some show more patterning on the head, and it's quite a variable bird actually. And our first storm petrel of the trip was the black-bellied storm petrel, with that stripe down the underside there. We did see later on lots of Wilson's storm petrels as well. One I was familiar with from the UK, but yeah, it was nice to see these black-bellieds for the first time. And even when we were eating, we found opportunities to look at the seabirds. So yeah, the facilities on board were excellent. It was a really nice way to enjoy ourselves, and we were spoilt really when it came to either being up on deck looking at the birds or down below deck eating the wonderful food on board. And it was a case of three-course meals pretty much every meal. So yeah, that was really nice. But we were here for the birds mostly, and the next day we started seeing some of the serious subantarctic species, headlined by sooty albatross with those long, slender wings. And our first prions. So these small seabirds, rather tern-like, I would say. Um, these became the most numerous seabird of the trip, but identifying them was very tricky. So there's 6 or 7 species of prion, several of which were possible on this trip, but being pelagic seabirds and moving around the Southern Ocean, any of the species was theoretically possible. The problem was getting a good enough view or realistically a good enough photo to identify them. The majority of prions is fairly confident in saying they were Salvin's prion, partly because they breed on the Marion and Prince Edward Island in huge numbers, millions of them. One of the other prions, and perhaps the only other one that we were able to identify at sea, was the fairy prion. So a slightly more cute-looking face, less heavily marked, smaller bill, and a much thicker tailband at the rear end. So these were ones that we, after a couple of days, we got our eye in on and were able to pick out. But for most prions, it was a case of get a photo and hope that it's good enough quality to be able to ID it afterwards. I did wonder whether we might have photographed Antarctic prion. These were apparently confirmed every day on the trip once we were into sort of prion territory. So yeah, I'm not a prion expert by any means, but yeah, it's fascinating to sort of delve into the ID features. A lot of the features revolve around head pattern, head structure, bill shape and structure. So yeah, largely at the front end. But a lot of these features are quite variable within the species. So some birds you just have to go, I don't know. And a couple of Salvin's prion photos just to show the variation. The bird on the left being very heavy build and the bird on the right being much more slim build, but I think both these are Salvin's. And we got one of the birds of the trip within the first few days. Perhaps, yeah, I think this was one of only 2 or 3 seen on the trip, perhaps. The Barrow's Petrel. And we'd actually missed one the day before, which I was a bit gutted about. And then we happened to be in the right place at the right time. Someone next to me called it, and I managed to get this record shot. So another pterodroma, but one associated with more tropical waters. So a bit of a surprise to see this far south. And here's a better photo, not taken by me, but just to illustrate the wonderful markings on this species with that dark cap and then the stripe on the underwing. And as we got close to the islands, we started seeing subantarctic shearwaters. This was part of the Little Shearwater complex of species, so I think it's been split off. And yeah, they are very small, easily mistakable for an auk in terms of size, but then they have that fairly distinctive shearwater flight where they would, on stiff wings, they would glide up and go back down again. And that was the more typical view of a subantarctic shearwater. On a sunny day, their underparts would be absolutely gleaming as they arced up. And having seen lots of soft plumage petrels, or softies as everyone on board the boat was calling them, it was great to see this Dartmoor bird, which are not very often recorded, and have the same sort of structure, but with this sort of sooty plumage was very different indeed. Moving on to the white-headed petrel, perhaps one of the smartest petrels, I would say, and rather Fulmar-like in their appearance. We only saw a few of these all trip, usually just single birds. So whenever one of these was found, it was always met with a bit of a scramble for people to get onto it before it cruised by the boat and was gone. And there's another white-headed petrel showing the underwing, very distinctive look with that white head, white tail and body. And next to a prion there, presumably a Salvin's prion for size. So it's been another good day out at sea and chalking up rather a lot of good seabirds by this point. And we went to bed very excited for what the next day would bring as we arrived to the Prince Edward Islands. So every day as we've been getting nearer, the alarm went off earlier and earlier. And I think the alarm went off about 3 a.m. this morning so that we could be out on deck by 4 as it was just getting light and find a place at the front of the deck. And yeah, so this day was just absolutely remarkable. Um, here's our first view of Marion Island. You can see the ridge line on the left in particular, and the peak of the island that rises to over 1,000 meters. It's taller than Snowdon. Was actually in the clouds there. But when measured from the sea floor, this mountain rises 5,000 meters tall. Um, and so it's incredibly tall if you measure it in that way. And this is a track of our route. The 2025 track is in red there compared to the 2022 track. But in 2022, unfortunately, they hit bad weather and had to turn around after only going around about a quarter of the island in order to get out of the oncoming storm. This time, fortunately, we were lucky and managed to complete a full navigation round the islands during one day and then a partial on the next day before we had to head back. And it wasn't long before we saw the light-mantled albatross, one of my most wanted on this trip. Such a smart bird with that black sooty cap grading into the pale mantle and the white stripe up the tail. We saw a number of these, but not many. So each one was very popular, and I think if people missed the first few, they managed to see more. So everyone saw them at some point. Just such a smart bird, and one you really have to get down to fairly southern climes to see. Another albatross was the grey-headed albatross. This breeds on Marion and I think Prince Edward Islands, and it's an important site for this species. Unfortunately, this is one of the species that's most affected by the problem with Marion, which is the presence of house mice. So the grey-headed albatross aren't used to mice. The mice have run out of other food to eat. So unfortunately, they're eating the seabirds alive, and the seabirds don't know what to do. They've not evolved with this threat. They just sit there. So grey-headed albatross is declining quite quickly, and it was really sobering to see them so close, such fantastic views, and know that this is a bird that's in such dire straits. So yeah, we just made the most of each sighting really, and trying to appreciate their magnificence and beautiful plumage. One bird that was potentially eyeing us up for lunch was the brown skua, sometimes split as subantarctic skua. It's quite similar to our great skua or bonksy, and these parasitize the meals of other birds for their own sustenance. And yeah, they were quite inquisitive. They came very close to the boat, often overhead. Another group of birds that became numerous around the islands were the giant petrels. So here's a northern giant petrel. Now, the plumage of these birds was very variable. So we got pale ones, but also dark ones and sort of intermediate phase birds, perhaps. But we could always tell the species thanks to the bill pattern. So the dark bill tip, or quite often reddish, was a feature of northern giant petrel. There's a closer view of the bill there. Also shows the tube nose, which is a distinctive feature of the family. And then the southern giant petrel with the pale bill tip, or sort of greenish in certain lights. So yeah, usually with these, if we wanted to identify them to species, we'd check the bill out. But yeah, very impressive birds in their own right, with the wingspan nearly of that of an albatross. And during our circumnavigation of Marion, snowy albatrosses became pretty numerous. I mean, we got little rafts on the sea like this one, where there was a mixture of plumages and ages, and I can't pretend to have fully got my head around the variety of plumages, but yeah, it was everything from juvenile through to adult and just everything in between, really. I mean, this bird has a bit of white in the wing there, suggesting it's starting to mature a little bit. But then you'd get birds like this with a lot of white in the wing and no white in the tail. This is an adult snowy albatross, and um, yeah, you get some old birds with a lot of white in the wings. But it's such a privilege to have these cruising by. I mean, sometimes we'd sit on our balcony and just another snowy albatross would go past, and I had to remind myself not to get blasé about them. And here's a youngster, so much darker on the body, very distinctive bird in its own right. And this was the picture from my starting slide, but just to give you an idea of the sort of landscape and what we were seeing that day. It was a sight I'll never forget. And we had quite often multiple albatross species in view at any one point. There'd be a line of prions flying in one particular direction, hundreds per minute. So over the course of the day, we estimated tens, if not hundreds of thousands of prions. And here's a snowy albatross to scale, just, compared to a person, just how big they are. It was hard to get my head around their absolute size. Yeah, just amazing. And then one of the highlights of the trip, we were lucky enough to see a Tristan albatross, which is critically endangered. Fewer than 1,500 pairs remain, breeding over in the Tristan da Cunha group of islands. So yeah, this is not guaranteed. They did get one on the previous flock to Marion, and we were very much hoping for a repeat. And yeah, this bird actually evaded quite a few people because it turned up last thing in the evening, and we'd gone up to the front of the ship and been told, "Oh, we've just had a Tristan albatross fly past," and we're like, "Oh my gosh, where is it?" And they said it had gone round to the back of the ship, so we ran the full length of the ship, and thankfully it was still in sight there. It was fairly distant, hence my ropey shot. But yeah, the ID features for this is sort of not fully understood, perhaps still. There's generally thought to be only this one age category in terms of feathering that can be identified at sea. So this bird had what they call a piano key tail. So most of the feathers were white, just with the odd little black feather throughout the tail. And so, yeah, I mean, this bird was reviewed by most of the world's seabird experts on board the boat, and they felt it to be a Tristan albatross. So, yeah, bird of the trip right there. But before we left Marion, we had business with some penguins. So the penguins were hard to see generally out at sea. So they'd usually pop up for a breath, dive en masse, and that was it. You wouldn't see them again. They could stay under for ages. So seeking penguins was a definite highlight. Macaroni penguins as well. These were the most numerous penguin we saw and breed on the Prince Edward Islands in large numbers. And yeah, so you could tell this species apart from the next one, which is the eastern rock copper penguin. So if I go back, you see the yellow stripe above and behind the eye is very golden in this species and is much more of a sort of lemon yellow in the eastern rock copper. But the eastern rockhopper's a smaller bird too. So yeah, this was one of the less common penguins. There was also a Gen 2 penguin, which I missed, but Sophie saw, so I still need to get that one back one of these days. And then on to a really cool storm petrel, the grey-backed storm petrel. And these are really only found around the subantarctic islands of the Southern Ocean. So yeah, we were lucky the one cruised alongside the ship for about half an hour, although it was on the side of the ship. We'd have to suffer a horrendous amount of salt spray and wind to try and see, never mind photograph, but it was worth it. We occasionally saw these where there were patches of seaweed, and they're sort of attracted into these patches to forage off morsels of food around these seaweed patches. And although it's really windy, we braved the bow of the ship, and that yielded some really nice species which we just hadn't been seeing down the sides of the ship. One was the pintado petrel, and this was a very lucky sighting. Whilst it's a common bird generally in the Southern Ocean, they were all away elsewhere at this time of year, and only a few pairs breed on the Marion Island group. So yeah, this was presumably one of those breeding birds, and absolutely beautiful plumage there. The name pintado is Portuguese for painted or pointed, and you can see those dappling sort of freckles in the plumage there. Another good bird we only saw from the bow of the ship was the blue petrel. And at first glance, these looked rather like a prion. And we had to probably look through thousands, if not tens of thousands of prions before we saw this one. But it's got a distinctive white tail tip and a capped appearance. The tail tip, in particular, in dull weather, did actually stand out. It sort of caught the light, and yeah. So as long as you were looking closely at the prions, you'd have a chance of a blue petrel. So yeah, we're very pleased to see this one. And the common diving petrel, which is a tiny little bird. I mean, think sort of little auk size, really. And quite often these would just be absolutely whizzing past. They never glide. They're just flat, 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 flat. And we'd either see them whizzing by, or if one happened to be sat on the sea, it would just dive under the water at the sight of us. So it was quite hard to get a photograph of these guys. There were a couple of claims of the even rarer South Georgian diving petrel, but as far as I know, none of those have been confirmed as yet. And an albatross, which, to those of you who went up to Bempton, you may have seen the black-browed albatross. We didn't see many of these because we were not really in their core breeding range, so we just happened to chance across birds that were doing their loop of Antarctica. But yeah, very nice to see. Although it's one of the smaller albatrosses, I think it's one of the smartest. And several days out at sea in all weathers was finally starting to take its toll on some of those on board. I speak for myself when I say my legs were killing after several days stood up, and even on a ship this big, there was a small roll in the boat, so you're constantly adjusting your stance to stay upright. So yeah, physically, mentally, it was very tiring, but fair play to those of us who stuck it out and stayed on deck. So that was our sort of time around the Marion Islands, and it was now time to head back towards shore. So yeah, once we got up to more tropical waters, we spent a lot of time on the bow, and it got a lot calmer as well, which was good for cetacean spotting. So we saw a number of sperm whales with that characteristic blow at an angle, not a particularly tall blow. We did see other animals that brought their tail out of the water, their fluke. But perhaps the best sort of group of whales in terms of sightings were the beaked whales. We saw several species, including Cuvier's beaked, This one occurs in waters around Biscay as well, a bit closer to home. The Gray's beaked whale, which, despite them being named after someone called Gray, they were also very grey, which was a good ID feature. And then the one that got everyone on board very excited were strap-toothed beaked whales. And these have very rarely been seen by anyone. So, yeah, it was a new mammal for almost everyone on board. And they had a sort of variable, I was going to say plumage, but patterning on them with a characteristic darker melon, so that protrudence on the front of the head. And in terms of other wildlife, we also saw a loggerhead turtle. Um, this one come up to the surface very briefly. Not my photo, I'm sad to say, but just to illustrate some of the amazing flying fish that were apparent. So there were a few different species, I think, but this was the most colourful, the yellow bandwing flying fish. And some would stay up in the air for, I don't know, 20, 30 seconds. It was amazing. And some new birds for the trip, even on our way back. This was a sooty shearwater. Nice to see, a bit like the Cories, in a different ocean during a different part of their migratory route. So, yeah, and this is a southern hemisphere breeder, so this was more down in its natural range. And surprising as well to see a few flocks of long-tailed skua. They were in fairly scruffy plumage on the whole, looked like they were molting. So yeah, I was quite surprised to see flocks of them, really. This was the most numerous skua. We got a few Arctic skuas as well. It's yeah, that was nice. And our final new bird for the cruise, some sooty terns. This is just a record shot, just to prove I saw it. If you can actually make them out, but yeah, birds of more tropical waters, but very pelagic terns. So this was still a couple of 100 miles offshore. And so, yeah, it kept tally of the species that were seen during the trip by everyone. And I think it was a total of, well, I saw 44 species of seabirds. I think Sophie saw 45 with that Gen 2 penguin, which I won't keep going on about. But yeah, I mean, 30 of those were new for us as well. So an incredible amount of seabirds we'd not seen before. And it hardly got a look in from me, but there was a wonderful series of talks being given on board the boat during the cruise, often by absolute legends of the seabird world, whether that be researchers, birders, people who just spent their lives at sea. And so here's one of the talks I went on the last day once the seabirding got a bit quieter. This was Hadaram Shirahai, who gave an amazing talk on his quest to see all the petrels of the world, and yeah, some interesting tales along the way. Another fantastic talk was by Peter Harrison, who literally wrote the book on seabirds and has spent quite a long time out at sea, studying all the different ranges of albatross plumages in particular. And there were a few birds we couldn't get to see because we weren't allowed to land on the islands. And for those, they had a fun onboard experience, a VR experience with these headsets. So here's Sophie trying it out. And some of the birds that are present and breed on the islands, which unfortunately we just couldn't quite make out. I did try setting up my scope on full zoom to see if I could see some of these, but as far as I know, no one did. So there's the Crozet shag on the left there, the Kerguelen tern on the top right, and the black-faced sheathbill on the bottom right. Since I put this talk together, actually, I think the shag has been lumped with a lot of other shags, so it's not such a draw perhaps anymore, but it would have been lovely to see it, I have to say. And this was the reason we were really on the boat, the Mouse Free Marion project, raising funds to get rid of those house mice I talked about. And during the cruise, they raised hundreds of thousands of rand, the local currency, towards it. And that was through various fundraising schemes, from sponsoring a hectare to an art auction with some beautiful works of art. Slightly out of my price range, but Sophie did bid on some stamps and won them, so that was nice. Yeah, so there's more information out there on the Marion project, and I will just mention it at the end as well. But a crucial project, I would say. Indeed, the chief scientist at BirdLife International, Dr. Stu Butchart, who was on board the boat, said he thinks this is perhaps the world's most important conservation project right now because of the impact it could have if it's successful in getting rid of the mice. And they're already putting the money to good use and doing some trials. This will involve baiting um, to get rid of the mice, and so they need to make sure it's going to be effective, because if one breeding pregnant female mouse survives, they will probably come back. But yeah, to have 1,900 people in one place, all celebrating the birds that we were seeing, was just a unique experience, I would say. It was like nothing else I've ever done. So that was the flock to Marion, and now this is part two of my talk, KwaZulu Natal. And yeah, so birding back on the mainland now, we set up a tour fairly last minute with Sustained Safaris, who had a nice looking itinerary and still had space. Um, so as people were flying in from all around the world for this for the flock to Marion, we thought there wouldn't be any tours going. So this was lucky. So there's KwaZulu Natal, and it's the state that has the city of Durban in, which is down at the bottom there, where the boat went from and returned back to. And this was our route, so we kind of went a bit all over the place, really. Partly to suit the fact that some of the guests in the group had to go after a few days, so we came back to Durban and then went on to other areas. And this route took in going west towards the mountains and Lesotho, and then up the coast as far as St. Lucia and Makuzi, not too far from the Mozambique border. So the birding began as soon as we got off the boat. This was a red-winged starling, a fairly common urban bird, but a new one for me. And a bit of a surprise was a Goliath heron just on a rooftop. I thought these would have to find some sort of pristine estuary to find these, but no, it was an urban bird. And it made me chuckle when Michael, our guide, put this sign on the back of the van saying "Birders on board, beware of sudden stops." So usually in South Africa, if a vehicle comes to a flying halt, then it usually means people have seen a large mammal or a big cat or something. But just so people don't have heart attacks, yeah, this is a handy sign so people can just carry on and leave us to it. We stayed in some nice B&Bs during the tour, well placed to get to some of the main birding sites we wanted to visit. So this was the Bird of Paradise B&B, and was handy because of the site that's known locally, I think, as the Clinzer Forest in Ashawi. And this is part of a remnant a sort of scarp forest that's quite rare nowadays. Most of it's been lost, and the patches that remain, each patch seems to hold on to some fascinating bird that isn't found in many other places. One of the cool birds there was purple-crested turaco. And we saw quite a few different turacos in the end. These are sort of frugivorous birds and spend a lot of their time in the canopy looking for fruits. Another fruit-eating bird, the trumpeter hornbill. This was a large hornbill, the biggest one we saw actually, with a distinctive casque on its bill. And a good-looking bird here, the violet-backed starling. This is the male that has iridescent plumage, and when the sun shines on them, they really just gleam. And another bird in the understory, but one that showed quite nicely, is the red-capped robin chat. And yeah, it was quite dark. I was quite pleased to get this photo because the conditions were less than ideal. We moved on to another forest fragment, because that's all it can be described as, unfortunately. But one that holds on to South Africa's only population of the green barbet. This is a bird that is found in other parts of Africa, up into Eastern Africa, but the nearest population of these from where we saw them is hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers away. So, really isolated pockets for this species. Much more common, but nice to see, were Cape starlings, another one with iridescent plumage. And so many of the birds down there have wonderful colours and so bright. Some of those, despite their bright plumage, actually blend in very well with their natural environment. And then others, like these guys, really stand out. On to our next B&B, another comfortable place. I was very impressed with the accommodations throughout. We visited the Krantz Kloof Gorge while we were in this area. This was on our way up into the hills, and spectacular gorge, not all that far from Durban, really. And as we were here, we were looking at African black swifts flying overhead, and African black ducks down in the fast-paced river below. Some of the birds I managed to photograph were the Neisner turaco, another member of the turaco family, and this one found just in this part of Africa, in South Africa, so quite a range-restricted species. And the mountain wagtail, a bit like a washed-out grey wagtail, but very much restricted to the fast-flowing mountain streams in this region. And it's always good if you see an oriole. The African black-headed oriole here. So I count myself quite lucky to get such a good view of this one. Leaving the area, we made stops along our route towards the hills, seeing the Holub's golden weaver, fairly uncommon bird in South Africa, and distinguished from a similar weaver, the African golden weaver, by that yellowish eye. And lots of lesser striped swallows. These were common, but have beautiful plumage and would quite often let you walk right up to them. Our next site on the way up in the hills, you can see here it's starting to get a bit more mountainous. It's a secret site. I was sworn to absolute secrecy for in order to visit here, so I can't say where it was, but we visited here for the montane blue swallow, one of the rarest breeders in South Africa, with perhaps as few as 20 to 40 pairs. So this is an absolute target for conservation in South Africa, and BirdLife South Africa are doing good work to try and conserve the remaining grasslands where these breed. I've heard there's a potential link with termite mounds for nest sites, so they need a landscape that works for lots of different species in order to be successful. And similar to the montane blue swallow were black saw-wings, so it was a bit of head scratching to separate these two, but you can see there a much broader tail there and broader tail streamer. If I go back to the montane blue swallow, you can see this is a male with a long, thin tail streamers. But yeah, it was nice to get black saw wings, and at times these were almost flying right over our heads within touching distance, so we were lucky to get good views. And it became a fairly common roadside bird, but it was nice to see jackal buzzards, a distinctive member of the buzzard family, with the dark plumage and then that rufous chest. And couldn't come to South Africa without looking for the national bird of South Africa, the blue crane. We saw a family group in some grassland, quite close to the mountains now, and yeah, such an elegant bird. That long, pencil thin neck and long tail. After a long day of travel, we reached our accommodation, the Makomazana mountain cottages. This was at the base of the Drakensberg escarpment, a long escarpment that cuts through South Africa, and the land rises dramatically, giving rise to high levels of endemism amongst the bird life. And the views here were just stunning. I mean, this was just the pond by our lodge, but yeah, the views back up to the Drakensberg Mountains were just jaw-dropping. So the next day, one of the days of the trip I was looking forward to most, going up the Sani Pass. In birding circles, this is a very well-known route up into the Drakensberg Mountains and up into the mountain kingdom of Lesotho. We were in a modified 4x4 Jeep, and it needed to be good to cope with the roads because they got pretty hairy eventually. On our way up, we saw loads of endemics. So one was the bush blackcap and the Cape sparrow. Now, this is found all the way down to the Cape in South Africa, but it was nice to see these up in the Drakensberg. And another bird with Cape in the name, the Cape rock thrush. And the bird that adorns the front cover of my field guide, the ground woodpecker. So these became fairly numerous, and you would get them in family groups, quite a sociable woodpecker. And it was just good bird after good bird. So next up was a malachite sunbird. Here's the male, just the most amazing emerald plumage. And a photo to show you the road up into the Drakensberg and the switchbacks, which yeah, were a little bit hairy. And I was glad I wasn't at the wheel and someone competent was driving. But we were heading up here for a few endemics in particular, one of which was the Drakensberg siskin. And even better, the Drakensberg rock jumper. So this is a member of an endemic bird family to South Africa. Rock jumpers with only two species in the family, this one and the Cape rock jumper. And with a bit of patience, these were quite confiding actually. So it was a real treat just to watch them hopping around, hopping from boulder to boulder and foraging as they went. This is the male. And that's our group all photographing the rock jumper. And so, yeah, and the times we'd lose sight of them as fog rolled in, but with the passage of time, the sun eventually came out and we got nice looks. So once we got to the top of those switchbacks, we made it to Lesotho, kind of a country completely surrounded by South Africa, and it only sort of lies on this mountain plateau at a height of nearly 3,000 meters, one of the tallest countries in the world. And we couldn't go into Lesotho without visiting the highest pub in Africa. And this was quite funny, really, because people used to visit a pub just a little down the road that claimed to be the highest pub in Africa. And then some entrepreneurial locals built a pub that was slightly higher. So now everyone goes to this pub. And yes, we all enjoyed a quick beer before carrying on with the birding. But the landscapes were just phenomenal. Sort of high alpine plains, quite heavily grazed by livestock, but still lots of good birds. One of which was the southern bold ibis, with that funny sort of skin on its head. It's potentially quite ugly, but that just depends on your opinion, really. Another good one was the Cape bunting, another bird that does stretch down to the Cape region as well, but this was our only opportunity to see this bird on this trip. And the Layard's warbler, quite a range restricted bird that we only saw in these high plateaus. And one which you wouldn't necessarily think would be all the way down in South Africa, but the bearded vulture or lammergeier showed well in flight. So we went to a nesting area where there's a big old nest on some precipitous cliffs. And given the amount of whitewash below this nest and the amount of nesting material, there's a good chance that nest had been occupied for many, many years. So that was the Sani Pass, and I've only shown you a small selection of the birds. I think it's one of the best days birding I've ever had. I'd really recommend it if you're ever down in South Africa. Just the gradient gives rise to a huge cross section of species in a fairly small area, really. On our way back down, we birded the Sani Resort. Very nice place. Kind of sad that we weren't staying here, but it probably would have cost a bit too much. We called in for breakfast one morning and saw some really good birds here. The grey-crowned crane. These flew over in a group. And the southern fiscal, a type of shrike, which is the sort of default shrike out here. We saw these fairly frequently. Leaving the resort, heading now back towards the coast, we stopped at some grassland and I was really surprised by these actually. I wasn't expecting the display of the long-tailed widowbird to be so fantastic, but they really have these. This is the male, and with that stupid tail, really, it was really having to try hard to keep a flight, and it must be worth it. It must impress the females, and but yeah, especially with those red wing panels. And the Cape wagtail, another bird with Cape in the name. This was the most common wagtail in the region. We saw a fair few of these. Not so many, but occasionally we did see pin-tailed wider. This is the male. It's a small finch-like bird, but in the male, the tail, which is several times the length of his body, really stands out. And I actually struggled to fit all the bird in this photo because the tail just went on and on. And another distinctive bird, the blacksmith lapwing, with this sort of disruptive camouflage pattern going on. Occasionally, if they weren't out in the open, they were surprisingly hard to spot. And so we headed up the coast towards St. Lucia and the sort of last area of the trip, really. And the landscape here was sort of open grassland, bush, and intersected with rivers and riverine forest as well. We stopped here at this bridge as it was a good site for hippo, which we did see. We heard them first, to be honest, making some dreadful noises. And then we also saw quite a large colony of weavers. This is the African golden weaver, here with the orange or red eye, which separates it from the weaver earlier. This is the male attending a nest. And hundreds upon hundreds of little swifts. So these were nesting under the bridge and occasionally would just leave the nest en masse and fly out in a big ball, perhaps as a way to distract predators. So we stayed at a nice guest house in St. Lucia. The town here was really nice and a perfectly safe place for visitors to walk around. And not far from the guest house, we went for a wander and saw the southern crested guinea fowl with all those dots on the wings, eventually forming stripes on the flight feathers. We were quite lucky to see these. Not everyone does, but they'd come out to dry off following rains. So yeah, that was a bonus. Another hornbill, the crowned hornbill. This is one of the smaller hornbills. We saw this in forest around the town. And the hippos I mentioned actually come into the town after dark, and there are signs up everywhere, particularly for tourists who may be unawares. But yeah, you do not want to be on foot face to face with a hippo because they can outrun you and cause a lot of damage. So I took this from the safety of a vehicle as we'd gone on a night drive. Also on the night drive, we caught up with spotted eagle owl. This is yeah, very large owl, and but one's the sort of default eagle owl of this region. And also on the night drive was a water thickney, so a member of the stone curlew family of birds, with a big eye for seeing nocturnally and for feeding nocturnally. So these were all out and active at night, whereas we didn't see any in the day. I presume they were roosting up in the bush. And we eventually came across a chameleon, which I wasn't expecting, but it was great to see. This thing measured 4 or 5 centimeters in length. It was absolutely tiny. Couldn't believe it. And yeah, look at those eyes. So on the boundary of St. Lucia is a huge wetland park called the Isimangaliso Wetland Park, and this protects a large area of freshwater wetland, scrub or bush, as it's known locally, and grassland. So we had a day here. It was nowhere near enough, but on this whistle stop tour, we made the most of it. One of the highlights was the southern banded snake eagle, and the Isimangaliso Wetland Park is perhaps the best place in the world to see this species. It's quite range restricted these days, so yeah, good we caught up with the park's top bird fairly quickly. Not long after, we saw a bronze-winged courser, which is was not expected on this trip, really. These birds generally have sort of drier grasslands, not often recorded in this park at all. So to see one and see one so well right by the road was, yeah, a real treat. It had been raining, so quite a few of the birds were drying out following a shower, and we got nice looks at this Petrel's cuckoo. And also this yellow-throated longclaw, which was also drying out. And you can see the long claws there. It's a member of the pipit family, but I'm not used to seeing pipits with that much colour on, to be honest. And a bird you may have seen in the UK or in Europe, the European bee-eater. It was nice to see these on the wintering grounds, and just like they do in Europe, perching on a stick there, waiting for a bee, probably a bumblebee, to fly past and then flying out to grab it and returning to its perch. So after St. Lucia, we moved just a little bit further up, staying at a place called the Missouri Bush Cottages. And the main building there just had a beautiful view out over the bush in this region. We stayed here so we could visit the Makuzi Game Reserve the next day. World famous site alongside the Pindar Reserve. A lot of people come here to see the megafauna on offer, and there's wonderful work being done to expand this habitat and protect more of it in the future. So, at the Missouri Bush Cottages, the habitat there was sand forest, and the sand forest itself is home to a small number of species which is completely tied to that habitat. One of which was the pink-throated twin spot, which is one of the birds I wanted to see most, I think, on this trip. And yeah, we were lucky to get this good view. There were a few, once you learnt the call, you could hear them here and there. So they were reasonably regular in the forest, but not a guaranteed one to actually see. Another bird that's tied to the sand forest is the gorgeous bush shrike. And Yeah, although there's a few branches in the way, you can see the main feature on it, that sort of orangey red throat. And feature of the bush shrikes is they pretty much all got beautiful songs. So after a shower, this one came up and lovely sort of liquid song. Also in the Sand Forest was this white-throated robin chat, and this showed really nicely. And we couldn't leave South Africa without trying one of the national dishes, the ijsbein, and our guide had been recommending it. And so on the penultimate night, we tried it. And I kid you not, it was pretty much a whole leg of ham. It was ridiculous. I could have shared this with about 5 or 6 people and still been full. So we doggy bagged it and took it away to eat the next day. It was so much food. And we made it to the Makuzi Game Reserve, which probably in terms of species was the most species rich day of the entire trip. We logged about 150 species this day, largely from our Jeep. And as you can't really get out in many places due to the presence of predators like lions and leopards. And it didn't take long till we saw some of the megafauna. So here's a giraffe. And there's Sophie in the wing mirror taking that photo. And another one was the zebra. My first trip to South Africa. So yeah, I've not seen a wild zebra before. But yeah, it's great to take in all those all that patterning. And another interesting mammal there was the nyala, which is a large antelope with those twisted horns on the head of the male. Yeah, so this one's a male. We did see females as well. In fact, they were quite numerous in this particular park, whereas elsewhere they're not so common. And on the backs of some of the nyala were red-billed oxpeckers, and these were busy picking off parasites and nasties on the backs of the animals. As it had been raining and then stopped, another bird that came out to sort of dry off right by the road was this crested francolin. These were fairly numerous, but would usually just be running across the road and disappear into the grass before we got anywhere near. And southern yellow-billed hornbill, or Zazu, if you've watched The Lion King. So yeah, nice to see that one. And it was one of, I think, a handful of different hornbills we saw in total on the trip. Moving on then to the largest bird of prey in Africa, the Martial eagle. And this was about a kilometre away on full zoom, but it still stands proud in this tree at quite a range. And then to end on, one of Africa's most distinctive birds, the lilac-breasted roller. It was quite hard to decide what birds to put in from the Makuzi Game Reserve because the diversity there was extraordinary. But I think, yeah, this is a good bird to finish on, and such a colourful roller. Even though it was a bit overcast on this particular day, that range of colours was quite something. So yeah, just to summarise, we saw 380 species of birds, and 44 of those were seabirds, which is yeah, a brilliant number of seabirds after only a week spent on the high waves. There were high levels of endemism on land also. So quite a few of the birds we saw were South African endemics or Southern Africa endemics, so shared with countries like Namibia and Botswana. We saw critically endangered birds, including that Tristan albatross. So yeah, can't expect to see birds like that, so it was a real treat. And if that's captured your interest, do watch out for a future flock from BirdLife South Africa. They've not openly said anything is in the works yet, but there's a few rumours going around that they are looking at a future flock, bringing together people from around the world. It was really fun, and I'd recommend it if you get the opportunity. And it was very reasonable, considering the price of a trip to Antarctica can run into five figures these days. We were talking less than £1,000 for this particular trip. So yeah, I would say relatively reasonable. And they have said though that they won't be going to Marion, but there's hopes they may think about going to Amsterdam Island, perhaps. So that would be well worth checking out. And just to illustrate, sort of just to let you know, the following slide contains slightly distressing images, but it's the situation on Marion, and I'm bringing it back to this at the end of my talk because it is really important that something's done about the house mice soon. As I said, they're eating the birds alive, and there's just no defense against it. So we've got to get rid of the house mice. And if you're motivated to support the project, there's a few details here, and I'm sure any support will be welcomed. In total, they're looking at raising, I think it's $30 million or something. They need to raise an awful lot of money, but they are already well on the way to that, and they are starting to put the money to good use already, preparing for the eradication attempt. So yes, if you'd like any more information, please feel free to contact me after this talk. Yes, thank you for listening. I hope that's been interesting, and I hope we've got time for some questions. I'll be happy to answer them.
Well, thank you very much, Henry. That was a fascinating talk. I'm sure there'll be some questions. So thank you for giving us that option this evening. It was really one of the most enjoyable hour and a quarters we've had that I can remember. Quite remarkable range of birds and cetaceans and other things that you've shown us this evening. I'll throw it open straight away. Anybody got any questions for Henry? Don't be shy. Just either ask them directly or through the chat box, which Gary's in charge of.
Go on, type it.
Whilst people are getting their act together, Henry, can I just ask you to tell us a little bit more about BirdLife South Africa? It sounds an amazing organisation.
Yeah, so BirdLife South Africa are effectively the equivalent of the RSPB out in South Africa. So they're the local BirdLife partner, and a fairly small organisation, but I think considering their size, they achieve an awful lot. And it's an organisation that's taking birders on the journey with them, giving birders these wonderful opportunities to see places, I think only generally like a handful of people visit the Marion Islands, usually researchers in any given year. So the opportunity to take 2,000 people down there, do it safely, raise money for an important cause, and give so many people a once in a lifetime opportunity is they're doing some really good work. They do all sorts of things to raise awareness and money for species that need support. So they have a bird of the year competition, which gives that species that wins quite a lot of airtime. At least a lot of people become aware of its plight, and they consequently raise lots of money to support the conservation efforts.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Hi, Henry. Can I ask a quick question?
Alex,
Yeah,
yes.
sure.
Sorry, it was a great talk, by the way. I loved both aspects, both parts of the talk were really, really informative and really opened my eyes to that part of the world. So I know we've spoken about, myself and Steph have spoken about the flock to Marion a couple of times. And whilst you were on the boat, did you find having a scope was as beneficial or more beneficial, or would you find just bins were enough?
I mean, we took scopes, and for, occasionally we did use them. The thing was, you were picking out birds beyond the sort of visibility of most people on board. So if there was something you weren't quite sure on and you called it out and everyone else has just got bins, well, they're not going to see it anyway. So in terms of a collective effort at birding, we tended to focus just using our binoculars and concentrate on the birds coming relatively close to the ship, which was a constant stream quite often. It was, especially down by the islands, it was there were no shortage of birds to look through with binoculars. So,
I like to
but
say some of them were only ideable at close range anyway. So I suppose some of those species you needed to get your bins in and eyeing on those features anyway. Yeah.
yeah, and then as I mentioned in the talk, some of the species you really needed to get photos of to be sure. So yeah, I mean there were a few outlandish claims on the trip that never got sort of confirmed. I think there was a frigate bird called, and there was even a mascarene petrel called, which is one of the world's least seen seabirds. So, yeah, not all of these things were confirmed, but when you got nearly 2,000 pairs of eyes on the sea at any one time, not a lot's going to get missed. So it was really good. And the guides were very helpful in sharing that news around the boat.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Right.
Any more questions? I see Julian is asking Henry whether there's been any outbreaks of avian flu on the Southern Ocean islands.
I believe so. Yeah, I don't know the situation in regards to Marion and Prince Edward itself, but yeah, bird flu is in the Southern Ocean, and yeah, given it affects colonial nesting species the most, I think it's very concerning.
Yeah.
But the way it seems to be going with bird flu is it seems to mutate and affect different species each year. So if a species does get hit, the hope has to be that the virus, moves on and those birds have time to recover in the following years.
Thank you. Gary, I think there was maybe a couple more questions in the chat box and I've lost it for the moment.
Yeah, so well, actually the question was about the bird flu that you've seen, but there's also a comment saying someone has just tried to have a look at the Mouse Free Marion website, and it's got a message saying the account has been suspended. So
that's a shame. Well, let's hope that's temporary. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe too many people have tried to go on and the aftermath of this talk, and you've crashed the website.
It would be nice to think that, Henry. Yes, that must be it. Any other questions?
Oh, Henry, great talk. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
I don't know if I missed it because I did have to pop out to take a quick phone call, but you said that penguins bred on Marion Island. I think you mentioned macaroni. Did you see any from the ship?
We saw penguins from the ship, yeah. I did have a few photos, so I guess it was while you stood away. But no, we saw king, macaroni, eastern rockhopper, and some people saw a Gentoo penguin. But it took quite a lot of luck to connect with the penguins. They were surprisingly hard to see because you just get the head sticking out the water. The rest of the bird would be mostly underwater, so they appear much smaller out at sea.
Yeah, oh, brilliant. The other thing is, it was great seeing the South Africa bit because I don't know, it's like about 22, 23 years ago we went there and we did like Mkuzi and sort of like around Durban and stuff. And one thing that I thought was really interesting because you showed the picture of European beater, and Keith Barnes, who was our guide at the time, was telling me that some of the sort of European species that migrate to southern Africa, like European beater, white stork, and booted eagle, I think they have actually started to breed. They've actually got like a South African population, and what they do is like in what's the southern winter, then they actually fly to sort of Central Africa, and they might actually mingle with the birds that originally bred in Europe. But I just thought it was amazing that some European birds like have gone down there and then they've decided it's actually it's not a bad place to live, and they've actually started breeding and doing like this reverse migration, which I thought was pretty amazing. But yeah, it was great seeing all your photographs and just the number of birds that you sort of you'd see in a day. It's awesome country, and thanks for taking us there, doing a like double whammy, doing the South Africa and the trip to Marion as well. So much appreciated. Thanks, Hennes. Cheers.
No problem. Just about managed to fit it all in.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, you said
Henry, I've got a question. Sorry.
yes. Fire away.
You mentioned that some of the seabirds you only saw them at the bow of the boat, at the front of the boat. What is there a reason for that? Why would that be?
I don't know. It could just be a bias that we only saw those there when we were there. But I did get the feeling some birds were perhaps more shy of the boat, and the bow was the closest approach that some of these would come in, and then they'd veer away or something. So not many blue petrels got seen down the side of the boat. So yeah, it was an odd one. But if you braved the front of the boat, you'd get a lot of wind in your face, but it did come with some rewards.
There wasn't any attempt of trying to bring the birds in closer by any like trimming or anything like that. I assume it's because you've on a huge cruise ship, it's not possible, is it? I suppose, but I bet it was
No.
probably mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, we did. Yeah, it would have been like really interesting to try, but no, it wasn't on the cards really. In fact, we were doing things to keep the birds away at times. So overnight, we were all asked to draw our curtains, and they turned lights off on the decks overnight
Yeah.
because there's a real risk of birds striking the ship and being attracted in. So
Yeah.
quite the opposite in a way. But no, with patience, most species eventually showed pretty close to the ship. So the first one of a species might have been very distant, but eventually there'd be another one that came closer. So
Thank you.
All right.
Henry, may I ask what the makeup was of the sea voyage in terms of nationalities? Was it very cosmopolitan, or was it mostly South African?
I think South Africans were in the majority just because
Yeah.
it was so convenient for them, and it was wonderful to see such a birding culture in a country other than the UK. Really, it's a big deal out there, and they are blessed with a wonderful avifauna and well wildlife in general. But not only were there lots of South Africans, there were lots of young South African birders on board. The future of birding in South Africa is very bright. And
That's great. Yeah.
but in terms of makeup, yeah, no, birders all over the world came in for that trip. And I mean, a bit like me, I couldn't believe how affordable it was really compared to the normal cost to get down to that part of the world because
Yeah.
there's high costs associated with it normally. There's no way around it. But this was a good value way to see the area.
Incredibly reasonable price, wasn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Any more questions for Henry? Time for one more. Well, if there aren't, I'd like to thank you on all our behalves, Henry. That was fabulous. It really was a memorable talk about what was clearly a very memorable trip for you and Sophie. And well done on your spirit of adventure in booking to go on at fairly short notice, but in presumably a short space of time, doing so much genning up. I mean, for a trip like this, where you're going to be seeing nearly 400 species, it's a lot to look into before you go. And clearly you were so aware of the significance of the things you were seeing. And that came over really well in the talk by what you had prioritized to show us, and then the way you described and explained their significance to us. It was brilliant. It was just like having an open guide to birds of South Africa and beyond in an hour and a quarter with your wonderful commentary. The pictures were superb. And what a contrast, I mean, between that displaying widow bird and the snowy albatross. You can't imagine two more different looking birds aerobatically than those two, and everything in between. If you wanted to be impressed by a variety of bird form and behavior and ecology. This was a tour to go on and a trip to listen to. So you've done us proud once again. We so enjoyed your visit to Finland and Estonia, the talk you gave us about that last year. I think this has surpassed it. It's been a real privilege to listen to, and I'm sure has whetted a lot of people's appetite for going to South Africa, both continental and pelagic. And certainly the group will be only too happy to contribute to saving Marion Island seabirds, which seems so very worthwhile, as you say, surely one of the most important conservation projects presently in the world anywhere. So thank you, and good luck with your ongoing work at Lakenheath Fen. I know you've got a lot on your plate and such an important reserve. I hope that the winter and all the work that I know goes on there in the winter goes smoothly. Thanks for giving us of your time tonight, Henry. Great to see you again. Diolch yn fawr iawn.